Hello and welcome back. We are on the subject of CEO pay and whether CEOs who get paid, extremely large salaries, uh, regularly in the tens of millions, sometimes even in the hundreds, whether that is too much and there something immoral about that. So here Moriarty is going to argue that yes, it is immoral and they are getting paid too much. So on the average in this country, CEOs get paid around 10 million. I think in the article, which was in the early 2000s, it was more like 8 or 9. It's certainly gone up. I haven't checked the most recent statistics, but definitely in the tens of millions is safe. Uh, and some CEOs get paid even more than that. It can get as high as the hundreds of millions. Uh, the pivotal point, as we've seen, was in the 90s when CEO pay started to skyrocket. It's increased by about 300% since then. Meanwhile, regular workers' wages have gone up about 30% since then. And, there's an intuitive general feeling that this is just too much money. Nobody needs it. It's a huge gap, between what workers are making, what CEOs are making. Something about it is wrong. Uh, but again, our job as ethicists is to figure out, well, are there any arguments for that conclusion, right? Or is it just a gut instinct? So Moriarty identifies three different analyses of the justification or the reasoning behind whether a certain salary is justified or not, is moral or not. And people, in their sort of intuitive revulsion against high CEO pay, are usually implicitly assuming one or the other of these. Um, and so the worry is people are sometimes talking past each other, right? So if someone thinks that CEO pay is fair because, they made an agreement and if both parties weren't coerced and voluntarily agreed to the salary, then it's perfectly moral. And someone else might be thinking it's immoral because they believe that CEOs don't contribute as much value as they're being paid, and therefore it's immoral. So if two people are working from different, ethical assumptions about what even would justify a salary, then of course they're not going to agree. So we need to sort of step up to the meta level and say, well, what is the right way? Is there any right way to think about whether CEO pay is justified or not, right? Um, and so he's going to look through each of these in turn, and he's going to argue no matter which sort of meta level assumption you make about what would justify CEO pay, it's going to turn out that CEO pay is too high, no matter what your theory about what makes pay moral or immoral is. So the first of the three views, the three approaches to the justification of someone's salary that people tend to assume is what is called the agreement view, right? And this just says, look, if the two parties agree on a salary and nobody's being coerced and nobody's being tricked, and it's what we call arm's length negotiation, meaning, there's not sort of self-dealing going on, that it's not, you know, uh, your buddy agreeing to pay you more than they would normally, then it's fair and square, right? Um, you know, it recalls Nozick's view of distributive justice, right? As there are, rules governing just transfer. Namely, if I agree to pay you a certain amount of money for you to build me a deck, then, you put the deck on my house, I give you the money, and nothing immoral about that, right? Everyone agreed to it. And so the assumption is that's what hiring a CEO is like. It's just like hiring a guy to build your deck, and if everyone agrees, then what could be immoral about that? So Moriarty isn't necessarily questioning that general principle, but he is questioning whether the sorts of negotiations that happen when CEOs are hired are truly arm's length, right? Are truly fair and square negotiations. Um, because the people that decide a CEO's pay are members of the board of the directors, right? It's a compensation committee, and they're supposed to be representing the shareholders, but the shareholders almost never directly vote for who is on the board. More often, the CEO nominates someone to be on the board, and that nomination almost always goes through. It's rarely contested. So basically, the CEO gets to decide who's on the board of directors, and the board of directors gets to decide what the CEO gets paid, and that feels a little too close for comfort. That doesn't feel like arm's length negotiation. So, I mean, and here's the reasons to think that this might be a problem. So, being a member of a board of directors is kind of a nice job if you can get it. Uh, they get paid in the six figures for not working very much, average of about 20 days a year. They have these meetings uh, to decide, when they're hiring a CEO and stuff like that, but then they don't necessarily show up for work every day, but they still get paid. They also get, many of the normal perks that an employee would get, life insurance, access to a company car, retirement accounts. And so if a CEO, right, nominated you to this board to get this pretty sweet job, you're going to feel gratitude towards that CEO. They could have nominated someone else, right? You're going to want to stay friendly with them. Uh, Also, CEOs tend to nominate other CEOs, because they're the type of people that will be qualified to run a company, right? They also, because they're the people you know and are sort of your friends as well, they're going to nominate them to be members of the board, but that means that all the members of the board, kind of have an interest in keeping CEO pay high in general, right? So that's going to be a motivation to offer high salaries. And finally, the board members don't have their own vested interest in the company. They're not necessarily stockholders of the company. They're not using their money to pay the CEO, right? They're deciding how to spend the shareholders' money. And so they don't have the same motivation to be thrifty that they might if, they were spending their own money or if they were invested in the company and their success was more tied to the company's success. So on the agreement view, in principle, sure, if you make a fair and square agreement with somebody to pay them, then whatever they get is fair. But Moriarty is suggesting that these sorts of negotiations aren't really fair and square, right? There's something a little fishy about them. They're a little too close. You're handing out money to your buddies that are helping you, right? So there are other views, right, of what could justify high CEO pay or not. The second one Moriarty calls the desert view. So on the desert view, your salary should be decided by how much you deserve to get, right? And there's lots of ways to decide what you deserve. Um, Maybe you're just exerting a great deal of effort. It's a physically demanding job, right? And maybe you deserve to get paid more for that, right? If you're lifting concrete blocks all day long compared to, um, the guy that just waters the dirt down, right? Well, maybe pay the guy that um, picks up the concrete blocks more, right? Um, Maybe you're contributing a lot of value to the company. So maybe you're the one that came up with the assembly line, right? Henry Ford, and you discovered a new way to produce cars that makes it much more efficient. And all of a sudden, this company is worth so much more money because it's so profitable. Well, you add a great deal of value to that company, and maybe you deserve to be paid more for that reason, right? Or maybe you've, been to school for a long time and have a lot of expertise. You've invested a lot of money in becoming an expert in some particular area of economics or engineering or whatever, and um, you command a higher salary because of that special training and expertise. Uh, that could be possible as well. Maybe you deserve more because the job is dangerous or difficult or unpleasant, or maybe you deserve more because the job is just very important and a lot of people depend on you, and the stakes are high and failure is not an option. Um, so on some of these metrics, CEOs rate pretty high. It is a difficult job to be a CEO. It is an important job. It does require a fair amount of training and expertise. Um, but that's not the question. Really, the question is, do they deserve to be paid so much more than other employees, right? Are the other employees' jobs so much less important or so much less difficult or require so much less training and expertise? And in this case, it's not obvious at all, right? So, is being a CEO difficult, dangerous? I don't know how dangerous it is, certainly difficult, but a coal miner's job is certainly difficult and dangerous, right? It requires a lot of effort. Um, Does the CEO add a lot of value to the company? Sometimes they lose a lot of money for the company, right? Um, and in any case, if you hire a CEO and the company does really, really well, it's never really certain whether it was the CEO's fault, right? Whether it was the CEO that made things go really well, could have been other economic factors, right? So it's very difficult to determine the value that a CEO is adding to the company, if they add any at all. As far as expertise and training, yeah, I mean, a lot of CEOs have a master's degree in business, but that's not, it's not a PhD in physics. It's not like the most demanding or most extreme level of skill that you might be able to get. I've got more training, right, uh, as a philosophy professor than the average CEO as far as, just schooling, because I got a PhD. I certainly don't get paid tens of millions of dollars a year. Um, the job of a CEO is difficult and stressful, but again, more so than a coal miner, not necessarily, right? They're risking death regularly, so that's stressful, you would think. And the job of a CEO is certainly important, right? Um, but that's a sort of a tricky thing too. How do we decide what's the most important, right? So if all the janitors went home, the business would fail as well, just as if the CEO didn't do their job. So how is one more important than the other? It's difficult to say. And there are other people with very important jobs that don't get paid as much, right? The President of the United States doesn't get paid as much as these CEOs. So, so again, Moriarty argues that on the desert view, it doesn't seem like this high level of CEO pay would be justified. You know, the most promising of the, conditions on the desert view would be the value added view, right? It does seem like, okay, yeah, if you're a Henry Ford or a Jeff Bezos and you come up with a brilliant way to extract a lot more profit out of an existing business, um, yeah, you've taken a company and you've inflated, you've magnified its value incredibly, and it could make sense to pay you uh, a lot, right? But those folks, even among CEOs, are pretty rare, right? So, maybe there's an argument that Jeff Bezos deserves his billions, right? But your average CEO is not that kind of genius, right? And they're not necessarily adding enough value to the company to justify their huge salaries. Could there be sort of a combination of factors here, right? So, we've listed a few different factors that might justify that someone deserves, a higher salary, right? If the job is difficult, if they have extra training, special training, and so on. So, maybe these factors multiply each other, right? So if a CEO is 9 times as skilled as a normal worker, and then also performs tasks that are 9 times as important or 9 times as difficult, then maybe the CEO deserves to be paid 9 times 9, 81 times as much as a normal employee. Uh, Possibly, right? But again, you have to compare the job of a CEO to all these other jobs that also require lots of skill, are also very difficult, require a ton of training. Doctors, scientists, uh, they make, you know, decent wages, right? They make a good living, but nothing near what a CEO makes. And it's hard to argue that a CEO is, you know, somehow has a tougher job or has more expertise than like, a Nobel winning, prize winning scientist, right? And yet they get paid so much more. Um, So, maybe if you multiply the factors together, you could come up with some justification why a CEO should be paid more than the janitor or, an average steel worker, but it's still, the math is not quite working out, right? It doesn't make sense why they should be paid so much more than a doctor. So the third, line of reasoning about what could justify a high salary is what's called the utility view. So you have to pay attention here because the utility view can sound a little bit like the desert view at first, but it's importantly different. So the desert view says CEOs deserve high salaries because of all the good they do for the company, right? The utility view says giving a CEO a high salary will do good things for the company, right? So it's a utilitarian sort of argument. It says um, the the company is more or less guaranteed to benefit if we pay high salaries, right? Um, it's not that you're paying the high salaries because of the benefit that's given, if that makes sense. So, if giving CEOs low salaries was better for the company, then the utility view would say, okay, give them low salaries, right? It just so happens empirically, or so this view would claim, that yeah, by giving the CEOs the high salaries, this is the best way to create the most utility. So why would paying such a high salary tend to create value for the company? Uh, well, the argument is it helps you attract the best people, right? If you offer a high salary, you're going to get that super genius who's going to increase the value of your company um, a great deal, right? Um, and so if you could get that genius for cheaper, then sure, do that. But the argument is you can't usually, right? You have to pay the high prices to get the great results. So is that true, though? Is paying $8 million a year the only way to get a CEO that's talented and devoted enough to produce all these great results for your company? Um, I mean, sure, the job is hard, right? They work an enormous number of hours, right? And so you would expect good pay for it. You wouldn't do it for minimum wage. Um, but there are so many jobs out there where really talented people work really hard uh, and make much less money. Being a philosophy professor requires a lot of training, right? Uh, an undergraduate degree and then 10 years of graduate school. Um, and I worked very hard, spent a lot of time at it, and not getting paid anywhere near a CEO, right? A surgeon, lots of training, works very hard, difficult job. They expect to be paid well, but they don't get paid anywhere near what a CEO gets paid, right? The generals, right? Someone running the entire U.S. military not getting paid as much as a CEO. Uh, University presidents running a whole, a university is at least as large as an average company. Um, they don't get paid nearly what CEOs get paid. So it seems like um, you can attract really talented, hardworking people to run an important, entity like a army or a university, and you don't necessarily have to pay them, $8 million a year or $80 million a year. So Moriarty has been through the three, possible ways of justifying high salaries, says none of them work, right? None of them are a good reason to pay a CEO 300 times what a normal worker makes. Um, in the end, he offers some prescriptions, which are interesting. He says there should be a maximum wage, right? So, pay CEOs well, but say this is the most someone can get paid in this country, right? 1 million, 3 million, I don't know, right? Um, but beyond that, it's silly to pay someone hundreds of millions of dollars, right? He also says we need to fix this arm's length negotiation thing, right? So CEOs shouldn't be allowed to nominate members of the board of directors. That whole thing is just a recipe for collusion and self-dealing, right? Um, and he thinks also the members of the board should be more committed to the companies they're serving. They shouldn't just pop in 20 days a year and sort of say, okay, yeah, give this guy $300 million and then, go back to their everyday lives. They need to be personally invested in the companies they direct, monetarily at the very least, right? So he's, argued that CEO pay is too great. He's offered some prescriptions on maybe how to fix that. And with that, I will see you next time.